Welcome to our viewers, both at the University of Maryland and from wherever you are joining us. We are delighted that you could join us today and very delighted to have Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson with us today, whom I will introduce to you shortly. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi. I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. And before I begin to go any further, I'd like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, the Assistant Director at the Bahá'í Chair, for her work in organizing today's event, and to our student intern, Sarah Rissanen, who helps with our social media events and helps us in getting the word out to everyone. Today's program is co-sponsored with the Critical Race Initiative in the Department of Sociology at the University of Maryland, which is headed by Faculty Director Dr. Don Dow. And of course, I'd like to thank my colleague, Dr. Rashawn, who also is instrumental in co-sponsoring this program. And of course, I'll introduce you to him in a minute, because he's moderating this program with me today. I would like to go over a few of the technical matters before we begin. So you are muted and your video is off when you join this webinar. You will have an opportunity to submit your questions in the Q&A function, but I would like to request that you hold off doing that until we end the official program and start the Q&A session. By participating today, you acknowledge and consent to your image, likeness, or voice possibly being recorded. So please keep those in mind, and remember about the Q&A, that we will not address those until later in the program. So every year, the Bahá'í Chair holds a lecture called the Annual Lecture, which is very special for the Bahá'í Chair. The purpose of the lecture is to invite a scholar whose outstanding work stresses issues that are central to the vision of the Bahá'í Chair, which is to develop a sound scientific basis of knowledge and strategies that lead to the creation of a better world. And the Bahá'í Chair promotes this vision through an intensive learning process focused on 5 central themes. They are structural racism and the root cause of prejudice, what we are learning about human nature, the equality of women, the challenge of global governance, and the challenges of the environment. As you can see, today's lecture, I think, is going to touch on several of those themes, and this is extremely important for us. We are so honored to have Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, and before I introduce her, I would like to just introduce the co-moderator of this session, because as you know, we are having a conversation with Dr. Johnson, and today I'm so pleased to have my friend and colleague, Dr. Rashawn conducting the moderating of this event. Dr. Ray is the David M. Rubenstein Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. He is Professor of Sociology and Executive Director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland, College Park. He is also one of the co-editors of Context Magazine, Sociology for the Public. I won't go on with, he has over 50 books, chapters, publications, and he does many, many things that there's no time in this program to go over, but his longer biographical sketch is on our website. But now it's my honor to introduce to you Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. She is a marine biologist, policy expert, and a Brooklyn native. She is founder of the nonprofit think tank Urban Ocean Lab, founder and CEO of the consultancy Ocean Collectiv, and co-creator and co-host of the Spotify/Gimlet podcast, How to Save a Planet. She co-edited the anthology All We Can Save, and co-founded the All We Can Save project in support of women climate leaders. Her mission is to build community around climate solutions, and you can find her at Ayanna, and I'll spell it, Ayana Elizabeth. You can look that up as well. So with no further ado, it is really my pleasure to welcome Dr. Johnson, with whom we will have a conversation today. Dr. Johnson, if you could just say hello to the audience.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So I will begin with the first question, which has to do with the edited volume that is coming out at the end of this month, I believe, if that's correct.
Next Tuesday, in 5 days.
Oh, in 5 days. And you will see the slide for that book and know where to order it later in the program. As I said, it's called All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions to the Climate Crisis. The volume features women at the forefront of the climate movement and mixes essays and poetry and art. Could you tell us a little bit about how this volume came about?
Yeah. So this volume came about because I'll tell you the true story. I was at a conference at the Aspen Institute, which is a bunch of like fancy rich people who are pretending to save the world for us. They have not succeeded yet, and they were having a big event on climate change. And I was so frustrated by seeing like a small group of white men always be considered the thought leaders on climate change, especially given that like that leadership clearly hasn't been enough to get us where we need to go, right? We need a lot more leaders. We need a lot more areas of expertise and backgrounds. We need people from every community leading their community towards climate solutions. And so I was there with Dr. Catherine Wilkinson, who's my co-editor for the project and co-founder for the nonprofit. And we just left the conference. We're like, this is not helpful. And we just went for a hike, and we've come to call this like our rage hike. So through these aspen groves, it's like beautiful in the mountains in the springtime. And we thought like, how can we change this conversation? How can we make sure that the dozens of brilliant women we know are listened to? And, you know, as we were sort of like raging and stomping through the trees, we realized, you know, like as you all well know, writing a book is one of the most traditional paths to being considered a thought leader. But we knew most of the women doing the most important climate work weren't going to stop doing that work to take 2 years off to write a book. So we thought we could try to bring a book to all of them in the form of an anthology. And it's been such a joy to, you know, co-create and curate this project. And like, it's too soon to say for sure, but I think it might be working. That's, you know, so this is a project that's like born out of frustration and a love of language and a real commitment to elevating the voices that we know who we think others would really benefit from listening to, and put it all in one book.
So Dr. Johnson, on that front, and first, Dr. Mahmoudi, thank you for always having me and the Critical Race Initiative be involved in this. And Dr. Johnson, it's a pleasure to have this conversation with you. On that point, thinking about your upcoming book, which I'm super excited about, and you just mentioned about voices being absent, or really people being absent. Could you tell us a little bit more about why you think it's important to amplify and highlight women in the climate change movement, and especially women of color?
So there are so many reasons. The sort of most obvious one that I feel like still needs to unfortunately be said is, women are half the planet. Do you really think you can solve this without us? So like, let's just start there. And it's the same for people of color, right? Especially given that both women and people of color, and doubly so women of color, get it more, are more aware and more concerned about the climate crisis. So if you would like to win, shouldn't we make sure to be including people on our team who actually like get it and care and are motivated to be part of solutions? So I'd like a fundamentally sort of like tactical, like pursuit of victory and stabilizing our climate approach. We just need, like, the obvious answer is include all of this wisdom and leadership. You know, and sort of there are many other answers, one of which is like, these are the, you know, women and people of color are most impacted by the climate crisis as well, whether that is, you know, because climate change is a threat multiplier, right? It just makes everything worse. And so making sure that we're listening to the people who are most impacted, who are closest to the problem, who then are almost certainly closer to the solution is another critical piece of this. And of course, you know, making sure that communities have decision-making authority in what the future looks like for them, because the future is going to look super different from the present, right? You know, we're seeing this with storms, we're seeing this with wildfires. We're going to have to like completely transform the way we live on this planet if we're going to continue to thrive as a species. And so not having that decision be made for communities is a really important element of this. Not having, you know, some white dude from DC tell New Orleans what it needs to do, for example. Like that's just not going to work. So yeah, those are some of the reasons. And I think, you know, one of the things that Catherine and I highlight in the first essay in the book, which is one that we co-authored, is all of the elements that are sort of considered feminine have so much to offer in this moment, right? This spirit of nurturing, this spirit of collaboration, this spirit of sort of like selflessness over ego and the collective over the individual, and sort of like the strength that is found in sort of like these elegant solutions. Like we need that sort of feminine energy, which has clearly been out of balance in the climate movement and all sorts of other things, right? And so we know that when we think about the patriarchal structure of American society and how deeply intertwined that is with racism, that we basically need to like really tear a lot of that apart if we're going to unleash all of this brilliance and ingenuity and creativity, so that you can have all of these groups bringing their best efforts to climate solutions. Because, you know, so one of the statistics that I think is most telling on this point is, according to polling by Yale and George Mason universities, it's been done over the past decade or more on American perspectives about climate change. You know, we often think of an environmentalist as like a white dude wearing a Patagonia jacket and backpacking, right? But in reality, 49% of white people are concerned about climate change, 57% of Black people, and 69% of Latinx people. So it's factually inaccurate that white people care more. And just think about like all of those people of color who care and are concerned and could be contributing to solutions, but have to deal with all this other nonsense sort of foisted upon them by racism and patriarchy and mass incarceration and, you know, violent policing and all of these horrible other things. So if we could, you know, sort of like one of the larger frames that the Movement for Black Lives has been working with in collaboration with climate justice leaders is this whole movement to divest, right, from all these horrible ways that we're spending money that are extremely violent and dangerous to people of color in the United States. If we divest, defund the police or all these various institutions that are not serving us or keeping us safe, what do we then invest in? And one of the Movement for Black Lives answers is actually sustainability and climate justice. And I think it's really important when we talk about like this movement to divest, which has been really strong in the climate movement as well. And universities are all being pushed to divest their endowments, among other things. You know, how do we sort of think through not just the divestment piece, but then the what are we investing in? And so those are some of the intersections that I think of when you raise that question.
Thank you. Could you tell us, what does climate justice mean?
So this is funny. Every few months I check the Environmental Protection Agency's website to see if the environmental justice page is even still there. It's been a few months since I checked. But they have a great definition, right? Like, are some communities more impacted than others by pollution, by air quality, by, water pollution, by all of these different things. It's like no one deserves to breathe less clean air than another community just because of the amount of melanin in their skin, right? Like, that's ridiculous. And yet that's the world we live in. Power plants are located exclusively in low-income communities and mostly in communities of color. And so when we think about all these intersections and the injustices at those intersections, if you live near a power plant and are breathing that dirty air, you're more likely to have asthma or cancer or respiratory issues that put you at higher risk for extreme forms of COVID and dying from coronavirus, right? And of course, like the implications for the value of your home, or even your IQ if you're breathing like extremely polluted air with metals in it, and that is what climate injustice looks like. And so the opposite is, if we all have the equal opportunity to access and live in a healthy environment on the environmental justice side. And when we think about climate justice, it's the same thing. Like, what does the future look like that includes all of us, that holds us, is sort of like the way that I like to think of it, because it's certainly not the direction we're necessarily headed, and it's not guaranteed, right? We've seen, when you think of hurricanes or fires, people with lots of resources can just leave. What if you don't have a car? What if you don't have some place to go? What if your health insurance is tied to your job? Adapt to our change.
So this is a great segue into thinking about the link between climate change and racial justice. And I mean, essentially, you're already being explicit about that. But as it relates to the link between climate change and racial justice, particularly in this moment, as it relates to COVID-19 and how we think about health and deaths among Black Americans, could you expand on the link between those two? I mean, on one hand, how we think about climate change, on the other hand, how we think about racial justice and obviously climate justice.
Yeah.
Why is it important to focus on this, and how should people be contextualizing it?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot lately about, the imprisoned people in California who are fighting fires, and the Latinx farm workers who are out in the fields picking our produce in the middle of this horrific air quality, right? From all the fires. And like that is the face of the climate crisis. Like, that is what it looks like. And, we also, there's some prisons in which the conditions are so bad that literally every single person has gotten COVID. And so, I mean, this is the evidence that hopefully no one needed, that the climate crisis is here, right? It's not some distant future thing that's going to only affect other people. If you're rich, you can sort of buy yourself more time, but it's coming for all of us. And so, the unfortunate piece of that is like who's getting impacted first and worst are mostly communities of color. And so, that's something that we've seen just during the coronavirus in terms of who has the resources to, not only keep having a job, but like figure out how to make sure your children's education is still being taken care of while schools are essentially like not really functioning. And who can like have enough space so that you're not all in one room all day driving each other crazy. And I'm really worried about what happens when winter comes and we don't all just want to like sit outside all the time anymore, right? Like, it's starting to get chilly. So yeah, these sort of the intersections are so numerous. And I think, once we start to look at the world through these lenses, we'll see all of this stuff everywhere.
So let's continue on that vein. You once said racism derails our efforts to save the planet. Could you explain what you mean by this?
Yeah. So, and after George Floyd was murdered, and Ahmaud Arbery and Tony McDade and Breonna Taylor, all in this rapid succession, right? I was like completely unproductive, which is something I've never experienced before in my life to that degree. I'm like one of these weirdos that thrives on checking things off her to-do list. I'm like, I'll get it all done. I'll write it down and I'll get it all done. And like, I'd rather have an orderly inbox than watch a movie, which is like maybe not the way to live, but that is the way I currently live. And so I was this feeling of not being able to get my work done was completely unfamiliar to me. And I was just grieving, obviously, for the individuals whose lives have been lost, but knowing that, there's another one every day. Well, it's so I wrote this story, this op-ed in the Washington Post because the environmental movement, although white people don't care more, is a very white movement, right? It has been historically because of the way it was founded. And I just felt the need to like write essentially this open letter to white environmentalists. It's like, I know and the climate crisis and racial injustice are separate things, but they are so deeply intertwined. And I know the climate crisis is like a big enough challenge without having to deal with race. And we all wish we could just deal with one, but we can't. It's like, it just won't work because we need to solve problems as they actually exist, not as some idealized version of the way that we want the world to be, right? And the world is complicated. And, I am a Black woman with a PhD in marine biology, doing my best, but like my Blackness sometimes means I can't bring my A game, right? And that was what I was trying to write about this. I shared in that piece this quote from Toni Morrison that says, I don't want to like blow it on this. You can't misquote Toni Morrison. So give me like 2 seconds to pull this up. So she said in 1975, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over your reason for being. And when I think of sort of like all of the things that people of color are not able to do because of dealing with all this other stuff, I was just like, white people need to understand this right now. And they can hear it from me because my reputation is as someone who's like super productive and doing all these projects and launching all these things that like, if even I am being slowed down and I have every possible privilege besides, a trust fund, the rest of it, I've got all of these opportunities. And so if it's hitting even me, I thought it would help to explain that. And I was just really astounded by the response to that piece. I thought it was just like, it was kind of like a diary entry. It was actually, there was a much more personal version that didn't get published. But yeah, thanks for asking about that. It was, it does seem like it was a helpful contribution to the conversation of helping people frame the various intersections, right? There's the intersection of climate and race around who's getting most impacted, and there's the intersection around who is able to bring their best to the solutions. And I think this is the piece we don't talk about enough, right? It's always like, oh, poor Black people, poor people of color, they're getting screwed. But I'm just like, we're also not leveraging, right? Like all of this brilliance and potential. And I wanted to talk about that side of the equation too.
Dr. Johnson, yes, that was magnificent. I mean, I remember reading your article, thinking about that Toni Morrison quote, and that is literally how it is. I mean, you feel as though your head is going to explode, like you can't get it out. And it does mess up the ability for people to be productive. Racism is a distraction, and a daily distraction for people at work and in their communities. And on that front, you've done so much work in terms of helping to advance this issue. Could you describe your work in building community around solutions as it relates to the climate crisis?
Yeah, so that is building community around solutions, climate solutions in particular, is one of my mantras. I think it's the most important thing I can contribute, right? How can we bring people together to do the work that needs doing? And there's so much work that needs doing. And I think the focus on solutions is important. The focus on building community is important. And I think too often when we think about climate change, people are like, oh, I need to lower my individual carbon footprint. And they sort of like pummel themselves in all this guilt about like, I didn't recycle that thing, or I drove my car today and I should have walked or ridden a bike, or, you know, I left the lights on. And of course, like, absolutely do your best as an individual. But I think what's lost in that conversation is how many things are out of our control, right? Because you don't necessarily, as an individual, get to decide whether it's coal or wind turbines that are powering your light bulbs. You get to decide which kind of light bulbs you're using, but you don't necessarily get to decide where that energy is coming from, right? If you live in a city without good public transit, you don't get to choose that that's where you live, right? You can't just like snap your fingers and have high-speed rail that you can ride instead. And so I think one of the ways that I try to stay focused in my work is to always be thinking about that big picture, always be thinking about systems change, thinking about how we need to transform our electricity system, our transportation system, our buildings, our agriculture, our manufacturing, like all of that needs to be completely transformed to be zero, you know, to be emitting zero greenhouse gases. And so if we're completely obsessed with like, am I allowed to eat chicken once a week, or do I have to like be purely vegan, then we're so like self-obsessed that we can't actually change the systems. And so, you know, obviously we want to live our values. So I encourage people to choose a plant-based diet and to, you know, think as carefully as they can about their own transportation decisions and energy use and all of that. In part because it helps align the work that we do as individuals with the work that we do out in the world. It's just like if you were working on race and you're just like a racist, you know, you're like perfectly unracist at home, but then you like are a total bigot out in the workplace, like that doesn't make any sense. So clearly we need this like alignment on our individual and social values in the climate movement as well. But I think, you know, this cult of individualism will literally kill us when it comes to the climate crisis. And so the community building piece is critical. And all of my most important work has been done in collaboration. I'm completely committed to you know, sort of like helping other people find that work, that collaborative opportunities. And, you know, that's one of the main goals of the All We Can Save project. So the book, this anthology of 40 women climate leaders, plus 17 poems, plus all these quotes and illustrations, has been so inspiring to me and my co-editor, Catherine Wilkinson, but also to a lot of the contributors and people who have had an opportunity to read it early, that we really just wanted to carry on that work of community building. And so the nonprofit, the All We Can Save project, has been launched to make sure that we sort of carry this energy forward and think about what we can do together. I think the most important word in the title of All We Can Save is we, right? We can't do this alone. And that, you know, obviously this applies to so many things, but I think on climate, a lot of people haven't thought about it that way yet, or think it's like so out of your control that you can't contribute anything to the larger systems change. And so that's also the focus of my podcast, is talking about so what are the specific opportunities for individuals to contribute to systems change. So if folks are looking for like a sort of irreverent podcast on climate change, how to save a planet is like weird, joyous, you know, so doesn't sidestep the seriousness of the problems that we're facing.
I really like the what you said about the cult of individualism versus the collective or the we that is really required in relation to the whole climate crisis.
Yeah.
And if I can just maybe change this line of what we've been thinking about and talking about a little bit, how do you think the climate crisis will impact and change international relations and global governance?
I mean, that depends on who our next president is. I mean, and this election is so important for so many reasons, but number one among them for me is like the future of the habitability of this planet. Like we can, as a global species, it's game over if Trump wins again for just on the issue of climate. And that is really scary to me. And not only has he pulled out of the UN climate Paris agreement, but sort of like US leadership is so important on this issue because other countries look to us for how high the bar is, right? And we don't even have a bar right now. And so if we are going to be a part of the global solution that's needed to this global problem, then we need a leader who at least step one, acknowledges it. Step two, a government that's not spending billions of dollars of our recovery funds on bailing out fossil fuel companies, which is what has happened, instead of helping individuals who really need the help right now. I think, yeah, I mean, I don't know how else to emphasize how high the stakes are. I think a lot of people who care about climate, are sort of obsessed with the imperfections of Joe Biden, of which there are many. But I think there's this really, there's a really powerful story on how his climate platform has evolved, right? So he had one of the weakest climate plans of any of the primary candidates, became the nominee, created this unity task force with the Bernie campaign, brought in AOC, brought in the leader of the Sunrise Movement, this youth climate activism group that's been leading the charge for a Green New Deal in the US, and actually listened to them and the scientists, and went from a plan of, zero emissions electricity by 2050 to zero emissions electricity by 2035, which is a massive shift. And the commitment to have like 40% of the climate funding for addressing the climate crisis go to communities of color, disadvantaged communities. These are major, major commitments. So anyone who's like, it's nonsense, they're both the same, they're both like corporate, whatever, I'm just like, read the plans. And there's actually only one plan to read because Trump doesn't have a plan. And so when I think about like what's possible at the international stage, the US is the largest contributor historically of greenhouse gas emissions. And we're the furthest behind in really doing anything about it. So if we're gonna have any leg to stand on as a leader internationally, we obviously need to get our own house in order. And so that's really what I'm focused on right now, is making sure that people understand how much is at stake in this election from a climate perspective. Because I mean, what we're seeing right now with wildfires and hurricanes and droughts and floods and random tornadoes popping up in places they shouldn't be, all of that is, exacerbated by climate change. And, we're only at 1 degree warmer than average Celsius. Like, what happens at 2 degrees, which we will almost certainly hit by this point, right? And so this is just a taste of what's to come. And if we don't have leadership in the US that's then sort of like exporting solutions and inspiration for us all to do better, then like, honestly, we are so screwed. I can't sugarcoat that one.
I mean, that's so powerful. I mean, you're saying so many things that are so profound. I mean, including not only your recent comments that you just made, but also what stood out to me is being anti-racist in the house and then being a bigot, and then being a bigot in the street. One of the ways that I think about it, I have a neighbor, or actually I think it's someone who probably rents a basement of one of my neighbors, and he just throws his trash outside of his car. And so on one of my runs recently, I picked up the trash and I put it on top of his car. Maybe I shouldn't have did that, but I'm like, it's your trash. Like, you need to know that people don't want your trash on our street. So yeah. I just took it and put it on his front windshield. But with that being said, thinking about cities and thinking—
My example of that is, I saw a tweet the other day, it was maybe a month or two ago now, but sort of like in the wake of this second wave of Black Lives Matter protests, right? Like, I'm sure we all know a bunch of white people who bought How to Be an Anti-Racist and, you know, a few other of these books, but have they read them? And I saw this tweet from this young woman who works at a bookstore, and there's this whole thing about like supporting independent bookstores, which I am totally here for. So if you want to buy All We Can Save, buy it from an independent bookstore. And her tweet was like, thanks to all the people who bought How to Be an Anti-Racist, but can you please come pick up your copies because we are out of room in our stock room. So wow. People like, not only people are not reading it, they're not even like picking it up. It's like, oh, the thing you're supposed to do is like buy the book. So everyone like bought the book and then stopped there, right? So clearly that's not going to be enough to get us there. We're going to have to like read the books and then change how we live our lives.
Yeah, I mean, it really speaks to your point earlier about who really cares about climate change, like the ability for certain people to simply care about something in the moment and then completely disregard it. And the example you just gave about the books is a good example. It's like, oh, I want to be a good person. I want to be anti-racist. I want to raise anti-racist babies, you know, with one of Ibram's other books. But I'm never going to go pick it up. You know, I'm never going to go actually engage it, or never am I going to actually read it. And so thinking about this and thinking about how we get there, I mean, even the way you just broke down Trump and Biden, which I really appreciate. And I found Joe Biden, his record, to be responsive to things, thinking about who does read and who doesn't read based on what we know about Trump, not necessarily reading his briefings in the morning, but being able to push policymakers in a particular way and shifting that from that 15-year decrease, which we know makes a big difference. How should we think about cities? Like in terms of how we think about cities right now, I mean, we look at the West Coast, which you just mentioned, about fires. I mean, whether or not we think about earthquakes, other sorts of natural disasters, hurricanes that are coming throughout the South. What should our cities look like in the future, and how do we get them there? How do we salvage our cities moving forward?
So a slight tangent to kick off this answer is that the term natural disaster is one that a lot of sort of experts in the field think we should stop using because it's not a disaster except for the way that humans are a part of those scenarios and have built and created their lives in ways where we put ourselves at risk, right? Like if a hurricane hits a deserted island, it's not a disaster, it's just nature. And so I've been taught to call them like extreme weather events or like, you know, that kind of thing. We have our episode from the podcast last week is called Unnatural Disasters. And so if folks are interested in learning about sort of, again, this spectrum of like individual preparedness to community action, there's a really powerful story in that episode by, you know, this woman in Puerto Rico talking about living through Hurricane Maria and government help not coming and her community having to figure out for themselves, like, how are we going to take care of each other? How are we going to feed ourselves? Like all of this kind of work, you know, and then there's the individual stuff that's just like, you should have a go bag prepared. And, you know, because if you can't help it's like the put your own mask on first thing, right? Like if you need help, you can't be helping other people. And so, you know, when I think about these extreme weather events, these fueled by climate change that are hitting coastal cities, I mean, that's the intersection of everything I sort of like have any expertise in and what I care so deeply about, which is right, the ocean. As you know, as a marine biologist, it's like my first love, you know, being extremely concerned and knowing, you know, a lot of nuance about what's happening with climate. I'm from Brooklyn, so big fan of coastal cities, and I'm just a super design nerd. So thinking about like, how do we actually design the future that we want to live in? And then how do we create the policy framework that's needed to have that future? Most of my work for the last decade has been in policy. And so connecting those dots, and then obviously, you know, cities tend to have a much higher concentration of people of color than other areas. And so there's a lot of justice elements wrapped up in this work as well. So I was pretty surprised to find out a few years ago that there was not actually an organization focused on coastal cities in particular, and how they might adapt to climate change. And of course, there are lots of individuals thinking about this work, especially, you know, government officials in various city governments around the world. People forever have been sort of living near the coasts and finding ways to adapt to what that means. But, you know, I don't have a specific answer to your question, but the more general one is we need to start with the step of envisioning and designing what we want the future to look like, and then think about how do we build a policy framework around that vision that enables us to have that future. And that's the work of Urban Ocean Lab, this think tank. And my co-founders are Jean Flemma, who worked in Congress as staff on environmental policy for 24 years. So when it comes to like the politics of policy making and like how to get things done, she's like probably one of the top experts in America. And Maurice Stillwell, who you know, runs a design firm in New York City and is an urbanist and has worked with mayors across the country, and is like this incredible Black leader who's trying to help connect all these dots. And so the three of us sort of joined our superpowers to focus on the future of coastal cities and what that means for adapting to sea level rise and also storms, and what role can restoring coastal ecosystems play in this work. What does this mean for infrastructure? There are so many questions, and you know, we're excited to be contributing to the gathering of solutions on this topic and to building a community of practice, because we just don't have time to each model through on our own. We need to be repeating each other's successes and avoiding each other's failures. So, so yeah, we're really excited about that. It's just starting to kick off the work. So yeah, stay tuned to Urban Ocean Lab.
So based on what we were just talking about in terms of coastal cities, I mean, we've been reading in the papers and in the news about how there's out-migration now from some of these coastal cities. And, you know, people are beginning to rethink whether they should be living in these larger cities. In particular, I'm talking about New York City with the high density of the population. I was wondering if you could say something about whether you envision that as some of the major cities begin to deteriorate, will smaller cities, maybe in the Midwest and in the West, grow in terms of this migration and movement?
So this narrative of like mass migration out of coastal cities or out of cities in general is like not actually supported by the data yet. It's like a very lovely headline for like alarmist style section trend stuff. But if we think about who has the capacity to just like up and move, it's a very small percentage of people who in the last 6 months have been able to say, you know what, like I'm breaking my lease, I'm like moving to my country house or whatever the scenario is. So just to put that in perspective a little bit, it is an immense privilege to be able to sort of like leave everything behind and start a new life because, you know, because of a pandemic when such a high percentage of Americans have no jobs at all right now. That said, like there is a very influential percentage of the population who are thinking right now about where we want to live. And I say we because, you know, I've lived upstate with my mother at our little family farm for the last 6 months. And, you know, until there were so many Trump flags around us that I was like, peace out, Mom, I gotta go. She's white, so I was like, they're not gonna come for you. I wanted to, my dad's Jamaican, so I was like, can we put up a huge Jamaican flag? It's kind of like a Confederate flag and that it has an X on it, but it means like the exact opposite thing. And I was vetoed, but I think, you know, there are a lot of people rethinking where and how we want to live right now. And one of the things that I hope sticks with people out of this horrible experience of the pandemic is how much people have turned to nature as something that like just makes us feel sane and sort of helps get us through. And so we need to be protecting nature just for all of these selfish reasons, right? For our sanity. Parks have been such a salvation for so many people in this time. So that said, a lot of people in California are definitely thinking like, should we be living in California? But then we interview people for the podcast who are like, yep, my insurance payment's coming through and I'm rebuilding in the same exact place. You know, my house just burned to the ground and maybe I'll pack a go bag next time, but like, I'm here, this is where I am. And so when it comes to coastal cities, when it comes to people who are experiencing climate disasters, it is a very human thing to want to stay in the place where you are from with your people, right? Like we have to acknowledge that community is tied to place. It is tied to geography. And it's so one of the things that we think about a lot in the context of coastal cities is this idea of managed retreat. What does it look like as we have to sort of like back away from the coastline? And the answer is like, we don't really know. We've never had to do this before, like move millions of people out of harm's way. And so step one is like acknowledging that this is something that is going to have to happen, right? Like the sea level is going to rise somewhere between 2 feet and 2 meters over the next few decades. And so we can't just like build a wall against the entire ocean. That is one thing that is not an option. There are 578 miles of coastline in New York City alone across the 5 boroughs. We could maybe build like a few miles of seawalls, which the current plan is, of course, to protect Lower Manhattan and the financial district. And so I think it's really important to just, you know, start to game out what this means so that we can even get to the solutions part. We have to get our heads around the magnitude of the problems, the challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. And I definitely appreciate the talking about unnatural disasters. I think that is definitely a way to think about it, is how we're contributing to this process. And accordingly, you've talked a lot about the various things, really systems and institutions that need to change. But if people are really trying to take away something here, what are the specific systems and institutions that need to change in order to realistically address the crisis of climate change and also center racial justice in these pursuits?
All of them. All of the systems need to change, which is like a scary thing to say, but like once you say it out loud, you know that it's true, right? Like our democracy is crumbling at the same time. We have like 5 crises at the same time, right? Like we have a public health crisis, we have a climate crisis, we have an inequality crisis, we have a racial injustice crisis, we have a crisis of our democracy. We've got like all this stuff happening at the same time, right? And most people are experiencing all of those things together. And so, you know, we need to change our system of elections to make sure that people actually have the right to vote and have that vote counted. And that's one massive big piece of work. And we know that the majority of Americans are concerned or alarmed about climate change. And so if people's votes are actually counted, we would expect more politicians who share those views, right? So as much as we want to think these things are separate, like gerrymandering is a climate issue because unfortunately, over the last 2 decades in the US, climate has become a completely partisan topic, which is the most absurd thing I can possibly imagine, but here we are. The future of life on the planet and like how whether or not we have a climate that is stable has become a partisan issue. And so thinking through sort of like the political system and how that needs to change, thinking about everything from like our building codes, where are we building and rebuilding, and FEMA needs to be changed, right? Right now you only get FEMA support if you like rebuild in the same place. Obviously that has got to change. We need to change our transportation systems and think about what it means to have mobility without greenhouse gas emissions. We need to change agriculture because the way that we farm industrially by tilling and like sort of like churning up all the soil releases an insane amount of carbon as we till and plow the fields, as opposed to soil normally being able to like sequester and draw in a lot of carbon. So we need to change the way we grow food. We need to change the way we manage lands. We need to be restoring ecosystems. I'm obviously a big fan of coastal ecosystems like seagrasses and mangroves and wetlands and oyster reefs and coral reefs that physically protect us from storms, as well as absorbing a lot of carbon. Wetlands can absorb 5 times more carbon than a forest on land, for example. So shout out to wetlands for all these like tree planting initiatives out there. I'm like, let's plant some marsh grasses. And so, I mean, basically, yeah, the answer is like all of it, including the way that we interact with each other and live in community and our system of like business and consumerism, right? Like we can't just keep like buying a bunch of stuff all the time because that stuff is made from elements of this planet. And I think for any of the students on the call or former students who have, you know, taken economics 101, you know that sort of the diagram goes that like natural resources go in and then there's like industry and then products come out. And like, people always forget about the natural resources part, right? Like you need nature in order to have an economy. That's the foundation of everything. And so making sure that nature is stable and and well cared for is the foundation of so many things. And sort of globally, when we think about sort of like resource use, a lot of times the intersection with race there is that poor people or people of color are more directly dependent on natural resources for their income, for their food security. If we think about like fishing and farming communities, think about people who need firewood or, you know, something to eat. Allowing these systems to of inequality to be as bad as they are actually puts a lot of pressure on natural resources, because people are like, well, this is the free thing that I can go take to take care of myself and my family. And so all of these things are unfortunately connected. And I wish it weren't the case, because then it would be easier, right, to solve any of them. But maybe that's not true. I mean, maybe this multi-solving thing has been the answer all along. And it actually is simpler because you're solving a problem that actually exists, instead of like this dream people have of this simplified model of the world. So I guess my answer to that is like, we just really need to lean into complexity. I think we're at this phase of work on climate where people are finally ready to embrace nuance, and sort of like not a moment too soon, right?
Thank you. That was a great response to that question. You know, I really appreciate your bringing to our attention the complexity and the interrelatedness of the entire system, which makes up this planet, if you will, you know, including not only the biodiversity of it, the environment, but the people as well. I mean, this is a very complex planet, but it's also a very beautiful planet in terms of all the diversities of plants and animals and humans, etc. And you've said many things to us today about the whole problem of climate crisis. And I think it's something for us to reflect on in the days to come, because you have given us such important information. I'm just curious if you can help us think through what we as individuals can do in order to push for a more solution-oriented public conservation and conversation on climate crisis.
So there's a lot that we can each do. And I'll start with sort of the generic list, right? So when we think about, you know, what we can do, we often think, okay, I can like march, I can donate, I can vote, I can help spread the word. The sort of like general things you could do on any topic. It doesn't have to be climate, right? You could do that on racial justice issues or anything, right? You wanna show up, you can protest, you can, you have, I like to think of like as what you have that you can use, right? You have your vote, your dollars, your voice, your sort of like sphere of influence, right? Like what are you doing with all of those things? But I think the climate movement and perhaps other movements as well have fallen short in answering this question, because that is the list that we've given to literally everyone. When instead of asking everyone to do the same thing, I think it's really important to say, well, what are you good at? You know, Rashawn, like, what are you good at? Like, bring that to the climate movement, right? Don't like do the same thing everyone else is doing. Like, what is your, like, what's the special sauce? Like, what's the magic that you can bring? And so, you know, I like writing, so I can write op-eds and try to like blow up the narrative, right? Like I know a lot of like famous people I can sort of like text to do things, right? And so I called in a ton of favors to cast the audiobook for All We Can Save to try to bring awareness to climate issues by having like, you know, Janet Mock and Jane Fonda and America Ferrera and Julie Louis-Dreyfus and Alfre Woodard and all of these incredible people like read the audiobook essays, right? Like that is something that I was uniquely qualified to do as someone who had like knew a lot about climate and like had some connections to Hollywood. And so like, I shouldn't be like obsessing over like, I missed the march this weekend if what I'm doing instead is these other things. And the best example that I have of this is a friend of mine from college. His name is Boris. He came with me to this march that Jane Fonda had been holding in DC called Fire Drill Fridays, each week a different theme around climate. And so like she really brought out like the middle-aged and older white women who have been her fans forever. And like, thank goodness, right? Like we need everyone, you know, bring your people. And so Boris came and he was so inspired by the talks, and especially a lot of the talks that week were around the banking system and how we're financing fossil fuel companies and need to like focus on banks who are financing the fossil fuel companies, because the fossil fuel companies are getting their money from somewhere. And like JP Morgan Chase is the biggest funder of fossil fuel development in probably the world, the US for sure. So how are we sort of like going to the root of the problem? And Boris was like, this was so great. It was really cool to be here. There were lots of celebrities there. So we felt like it was very sparkly too. And he was like, well, what do we do now? Do we just come back next Friday? And I was like, no, Boris, you're the vice president of a financial services company. You go back to work and you create like an environmentally sustainable investment fund, and you change finance, you change your business. Like you use what you're good at to push forward solutions. And he was like, oh, I could do that. And he did. He literally started an environmentally responsible investment fund. And in the wake of a Black Lives Matter protests, he did the same for a fund for racial justice, partnering with the NAACP. And obviously, like, he has a very specific position. That's not gonna be what everyone does, right? Like, he's got all the fancy degrees and, you know, is in the leadership of this company, but like, where do you have influence? And like, what are the skills that you can bring? As I think this like mapping of our, sort of like power mapping of our own, ourselves is a really important part of this process, right? So when I was like, I need to make a bigger contribution. Okay, I'm a Brooklyn girl with a PhD in marine biology who's like really freaked out about climate change and cares about justice. Like, oh, I'll work on that. So we each have to find our own thing, which seems like a cheating answer to the question of what can we do, but like, it's really not. And I think it'll be so much more enjoyable for you if you're doing what you're good at. Like if you're a web designer who wants to help, you know, a nonprofit get the message out, or an artist or a musician, or you're really cool and people listen to you and like you're a trendsetter, or you're a lawyer, whatever it is, or there's like masseuses that volunteer to help people who work on climate change all day and just like rub their backs because this work is so incredibly stressful. Like whatever you're good at, that's what is needed.
That was great. I don't even have, but I mean, I think this last question we have is really thinking about moving us to the future. And I mean, you've essentially talked about this in a sense of how we should think about cities and what people can do. And I really appreciate you saying that, is what can you bring to the table as an individual? What can you do? So if you had your druthers, how do we begin to plan for a future in relation to climate change? And maybe even more so, how should we design that future? And I know you say we should focus on all social institutions, but in thinking about that, what does that look like? And you talked about the role individuals play, but I mean, if you had a crystal ball, and on this topic, you do in a lot of different ways in terms of your impact, what does that look like moving forward so that the deleterious outcomes as it relates to the climate that people hear, that's gonna hit us sooner rather than later, how do we do something about that?
We spend all of the minutes that we have in the next 40 days or whatever it is, making sure we have a new president, honestly, like, because everything is so much worse if we don't get that piece right. And I know that it's sort of like uncouth to be political in an academic context, perhaps, but like, these are the facts, right? Like, we have one candidate who's denying the climate change is even happening, and another who has like the most progressive and aggressive plan to address the climate crisis that we've ever seen. It's like way far ahead of what Bernie's was 4 years ago. And so, I mean, we all need to be doing, like, what are the skills we can bring to that right now, right? Like, is it talking to friends and family? Is it, organizing to make sure people have their absentee ballots? Is it, texting people in swing states or doing phone calls to swing states? Is it like getting all your friends together to all donate up and down the ballot? All of these positions matter, right? City councils are deciding on whether we have composting, and food waste is, a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. Your mayors and local representatives are deciding how much they're investing in public transit. Like, this is election season. And so, like, if you need to drive a car everywhere for the next 40 days to get this done and make sure we elect people who actually understand what's going on and what needs to be done to address the climate crisis, then, like, you have my permission. Do what you need to do. And I think people don't understand enough sort of how much it matters for local elections too, right? Is your city investing in renewable energy in that transition? Sort of like, is your city electing people who are preparing for the unnatural disasters that are coming our way? I mean, these are questions we should be asking politicians before, and so, as we make them earn our votes, and then holding them accountable after they're elected. And one of the things that I think about a lot in this regard is what a friend of mine was saying the other day, like, when you elect a politician, you're not choosing like your hero, you're choosing your preferred adversary. Like, who do you want to be pushing for the next 2, 4, 6 years, right? Like, who do you want to be up against? Like, who might possibly listen to you and be swayed by the facts that you present? Because, like, Lord knows none of these people are perfect. I was a surrogate for Elizabeth Warren, so clearly I didn't get my way. But we all have to charge ahead and make sure that we are doing the best for the people we care about and the issues that we care about. And so the thing we can do right now for coastal cities, for the climate crisis, for incarcerated people who are fighting wildfires for us, for all of these things, is make sure we have new politicians after this election who are going to take these issues seriously. So yeah, find a way to get involved in whatever way feels comfortable for you. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who was like, I've been going to homeless shelters with a printer and envelopes to help people request their absentee ballots. And I'm like, who are you doing this with? She was like, I'm just doing it. Like, you don't need anyone's permission to help someone print out a form and give them a stamp, right? And so I think so often we're waiting for someone to tell us what to do. And like, probably no one is going to. So my friends are like, let's start a group where, a few hours a week, we all just like hop on a Zoom and all challenge each other to see how many people we can text in swing states together about voting. Because what we see when we think about the last election is that it was like, in terms of the popular vote, that Hillary won the popular vote by like 3 million votes, but obviously Trump won the electoral vote. And, you know, and that it was like sort of 50-50. But the answer is it was 25-25 and 50% of Americans didn't vote. So that's sort of like, that's where we are, right? So, so we need, yeah, that's the most important thing right now.
Thank you. So I think at this point, we will open it up to the Q&A. To our listeners, you see where the Q&A function is, and please begin posting your questions to Dr. Johnson.
I'm going to put in the chat the links to Urban Ocean Lab.
Great.
In case people want to look that up.
Sure.
And to the book.
And to the book, yes.
I guess you need the H's.
Yeah. Questions from the audience?
So Dr. Johnson, as we're transitioning here, I'll ask additional questions. So as I think about you and the work you do, and we kind of started talking about the dearth of representation in your field, how do we do something about that? You know, it's easy to simply say, oh, well, we need to expose kids when they're young, you know, and we need to change the racial and gender discrimination that's in the pipeline. Yes, those things are true. But what do you see from your perspective that will really shift some of these things in monumental ways? Because, I mean, if we give a comparison to, say, medicine, for example, I mean, we've been doing all these things for a century, and the percentage of Black physicians, particularly Black women physicians, has not changed in 100 years. So all this progress we've supposedly made in terms of diversifying fields that have traditionally put up barriers, more so than, say, the social sciences, where Dr. Mahmoudi and I are, there are drastic differences between those. So how do you see that? Because, I mean, I really see some of the best ideas is coming from people who are younger than us. I mean, they're just innovative. They haven't been imprinted by the world. They haven't been socialized to, for example, like one thing I'm going to start saying is, I'm not gonna be calling them natural disasters anymore. Like even that shift for kids, they're like I think about my oldest kid, he's like that. He's kind of like, well, what did we do to contribute to that? And if we weren't here, then we wouldn't have really known about this thing. Like he's already doing that, and I'm imprinting certain things on him. So, I mean, that's a long way of kind of saying, how should we think about the pipeline process here?
So I went to Harvard, and a lot of the Black kids that I was friends with as an undergrad were the first to go to college in their family, and to get into Harvard, obviously an enormous deal. Your family is super proud. There's a lot of pressure to do right by your family, by your community, because often like it literally takes a village to get a Black kid from the hood into an Ivy League school. Like, you know, someone was like tutoring that kid and like picking up the slack on chores for the smart kid, and in your church was fundraising for your college applications or whatever it was, right? And so you've got all these people sort of like counting on you to make it. And I think one of the things that comes with that pressure is a narrowing of what you feel like it's okay to pursue academically, right? Like so many of those people choose like business or law or medicine, just like, let me do the things that like we know what the job is at the end of it. And then, you know, like have a guaranteed legitimate income as the outcome, so that you actually like have the financial success, can take care of your family and like contribute in that way and like sort of make it, right? You want to be the one that makes it, who starts to shift all these other things that you just described, right? Because like once you're in a position of power, then you can decide who you're opening the door for behind you. And that just makes me really, really sad. Because obviously, you know, Black folks are interested in everything, not just medicine and business and law. And, you know, I'm sort of speaking, you know, out of school here because I don't have the stats to back this up. This is purely anecdotal. And, you know, I was the weirdo who was like, no, I'm going to be a marine biologist. People are like, why? And I was like, I don't know. I love the ocean. This is what we're doing. And, you know, with a Jamaican father who grew up fishing and understanding sort of like how much was at stake in terms of culture and economy and food security if we didn't get this right. So that is just another articulation of the problem. That is not the solution. But I think the thing that comes to mind for me is that we need to change philanthropy. Like, I want white people who have made millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, taking ridiculous risks with other people's money to take ridiculous risks with the money they probably shouldn't have because they exploited a lot of people to get it and were supported by the government to get it. They need to give it away with the same level of risk tolerance through which they built their fortunes, right? We need philanthropy to look a lot more like venture capital. We need all of these people to say, like, I'm going to take a risk on Ayanna. She's starting the Urban Ocean Lab. We have no idea if it's going to work, but like, here's $1 million bet on the future, because if she does figure it out, that really matters. The same way you think about investing in a portfolio of companies, right? Like, everyone wants the Silicon Valley unicorn company that becomes $1 billion company, but you know, you sort of assume that maybe 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 20 investments in your portfolio will be really successful. And the rest you're just like, oh, well, like, we need to bring some of that vibe to how we give away our money. Like, if we're all betting on the sure thing, then we're not betting on anything interesting. We're not betting on anything that's going to change or shift paradigms. So yeah. And I think also philanthropy tends to be structured around maintaining the size of endowments. And with the world literally on fire, what are we saving it for the future, right? Like, give it, if you actually want to solve, like, give it all away now. So that's, I mean, and give it to people of color, like, give it to people who are in communities, who know what communities need or can help figure that out. And they won't, all these projects won't work, and that's fine, because some of them will. And so that's, can you tell I'm in fundraising mode and I'm just like really angry at the conversations I'm having with this old guard of like,
yeah, I feel the same way. And I love this conversation. Because
how many pages do you need for a small grant? Like, miss me with this nonsense.
I'm tired of writing grants. But the thing that you're really talking about is who has the ability to take risk. You know, part of the problem is that oftentimes Black people, back to your point you said earlier about, you know, just the distractions of racism. Mm-hmm. One big distraction is that rarely we can't ever take risk. We have to do something that we perceive is going to pay dividends. We can't bet on ourselves in the same way. And I mean, that's just a great point. But I know we have questions, so I'm going to let Hoda, I could talk to you forever.
We have questions. So the first one is, can you see humanity possibly moving from physical goods to virtual reality, and virtual goods overcoming some of the downside sides of materialism while still being happy?
First of all, things don't make us happy. I mean, the social science is behind that, right? Like, having more things doesn't make you happier. And over a certain level of income, having more money doesn't make you happier. So I think we just need to be careful of this sort of like false association between possessions and happiness. Although I will say I now own a car for the first time in ages. It's an electric car and it's awesome. And I'm really excited to have that mobility. But, you know, but I only need one car. I don't need a collection of cars.
Rashawn?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so many good questions in the chat. So I think
there's one at the bottom that I want to take on. So Denise Mejia, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. I think we should tax them a lot more. I think by them you mean rich people who I was talking about in the context of philanthropy. Or are we calling on her to say her question? Sorry, something just happened and it moved.
I don't think so. I think you can address the question.
You can, if that's what you'd like to do, go ahead.
The question just disappeared, but I I remember it, it's like, did I not listen to Elizabeth Warren? Clearly we need to tax these people. And the answer is both, right? We need to tax them, and we also need to sort of like incite the literal just like giving away of the money. So it's not either or. We absolutely need both. Yes, tax the rich. They made their money off of a lot of things that the government has paid for.
And she just responded that you got her question right.
Oh, well, good that we were open-minded in seeking answers too.
Hey, Sean, do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, I think the question by Madison Plunkert, which is at the top, what changes should environmental organizations be making to better include anti-racism in their environmentalism?
What changes should environmental groups be making?
Yeah, so what changes should environmental groups be making, or environmental organizations specifically, should they be making to include anti-racism in their environmentalism work?
The list is long. I think, oftentimes people want to like hire a chief diversity officer and then give them no resources or power or decision-making ability. And like, that's clearly not going to get us there. And so making sure that, these discussions are integrated into all decision-making of your organization, not just like a box to check at the end, but a part of the process on not just hiring, but on how you're structuring your campaigns and initiatives, how you're pressure testing these things. And I think one of the sort of like the wrong way to do it is to make your Black employees do more work in vetting all of your stuff to help you be anti-racist, because that happens all the time. I'm constantly asked to like, help us craft our Black Lives Matter statement. I'm like, that's not my job. Unless it is my job, in which case, great. But like, I think a lot of what we're seeing is like organizations putting more of a burden on their employees of color to help them get it right. And just like hire people who can do that, or hire consultants who can do that, and pay them for their time, as opposed to overtaxing the few people of color in your organization, making them speak for you, making them do the press for you, making them write your statements, like all of that stuff. It's not the answer. And in the same way that I talked about philanthropy, a lot of environmental groups have massive bank accounts, right? The Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International. These are like hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank kind of nonprofits. And so when they want to do it right, I think often they don't have the ability in-house. It means they should be partnering with local organizations led by people of color and sharing their resources with them, helping them fundraise, supporting them behind the scenes, and not asking for credit, right? Like, those are some of the most important things we can be doing, is like ensuring the success of the next generation of environmental leaders. Because what happens instead is like, oh, we're going to partner with this local environmental justice group, and then we're going to like take all the credit because we have a huge PR team that can spin the press release. And I'm so sick of seeing that nonsense. So just like, I think, share your resources and take less credit is like sort of an easy shorthand for one approach there.
Thank you. The next question from Joshua Lincoln, thanking us for this great conversation and asking, at the international level, climate change as a field has been changed by non-state actors, the climate movement, cities, local governments, youth, and critically businesses. But my sense in this is that this can't be done without governments in the end. In the Paris Agreement, the NDC, the nationally determined contributions, sufficient to get us there. And do you have any thoughts about the connection between the global level and some of the systematic inequalities, injustices you've talked about at the national level?
I mean, I'm a policy nerd, right? So I think a lot about what is possible at the federal and international levels, as well as the city level. And so I don't think we can do it alone. I don't think we can do it without governments. We can do a lot without them, but we can't as private citizens necessarily transform public transportation, right? And so I think, you know, back to this being election season, like we've got to get it right in this election at all levels of government that we're voting for. And judges, oh my God, judges are so important. And the people who appoint them you need to know who they are. So I guess I would say, like, when I look at the science, I see that the projections are dire, but there is a wide range of possible futures. And every day I get up and I'm like, how do we have the best of the possible futures? And a lot can be done at a community level, but like right now I'm certainly focused on the electoral level. So yeah, I mean, this sort of nationally determined contributions piece is, for those who don't know, like every country who's a part of the Paris Agreement had to say like how much they were going to contribute to emissions reductions. And there's a mechanism for increasing that commitment over time. And that's coming up next year. It was supposed to be this year, but then COVID happened. And so the conference is postponed and all this, right? So making sure that politicians know that you want them to do more really matters, because politicians are often followers and not leaders, right? They are looking to public opinion, they are looking to polling, they are looking to know, will you reelect me if I go out on this limb? They don't want to go out on a limb. And so making sure that we are all sort of like raising our collective voice for the things, the changes that we need actually really does matter. Like when there was this movement in support of a Green New Deal, suddenly you had over 100 members of Congress co-sponsoring it. You had every major, almost every candidate on the Democratic side in the primary endorsing it. And you have a whole new set of policies that are possible because of that. And that's how much, sort of like, and how quickly the status quo can shift. And so I think we have a lot more power than we know. It's just a matter of figuring out like exactly how we can best use that. So your question is like, it's a huge question. It's really hard for me to answer, but and I'm probably not the best person to answer that particular question, but I certainly appreciate it. Yeah, I struggle with this balance between like, we need governments to lead the charge and like, well, they're not. So my mom and I have a farm upstate where we're trying to model what it looks like to live sustainably. So it's like both, right? We've got to sort of walk and chew gum on this one. But for the next month and a half, we can just focus on the election.
So I want to ask this question by Julia. And she asked, do you have tips for speaking with people who are apathetic towards the climate crisis? So how can we successfully make others understand the importance and urgency of it? And in this regard, I'm really thinking about people who are like, I'm not going to be around to be living through this anyway. So, I mean, what is your response? And
that is such a selfish like way to see the world. It's quite common, right? Like, it doesn't affect me, so I'm not going to worry about it. It's like, do you not care about any other humans on the planet, you jerk? Which is maybe not a way to convince someone to care more by calling them a jerk or worse. So my answer there is, but often like that response that like, I'm not going to be here, so I'm not going to worry about it, actually comes from fear and like a sense of lack of agency. When people say like, I'm not going to be here, it often means like, I don't even know how I would even start to be a part of the solution, right? And so I don't talk to climate deniers. I just don't have time. They're only like 7 or 8% of America. Like, we can do this without them. So I'm not going to waste my time. But for the people who are like, who aren't quite sure to engage or like don't understand how the dots connect, obviously willing to have those conversations. And the answer there is like, what do they care about? Like, what are they worried about? And then how can we connect that to a changing climate, right? Are you worried about your family who are farmers in the Midwest and what the insane cycle of floods and droughts means for them, means for for rural communities, then like, let's talk about that part of it. You know, if you're like, if you have like asthma or respiratory issues, and we can talk about like the air quality of fires and fossil fuel plants, right? This is like a here and now issue for everyone who has respiratory issues. And so all of these things, it's just like, what do you care about? And then like the game of connecting it to climate issues. It's like, it's not like 6 degrees of separation. It's like 0 degrees. Let me just like, here are the 2 dots, right? And so I think, you know, it takes some amount of education to understand that. Like, do you like skiing? Well, too bad, because like most ski resorts are having shorter seasons now because there's not enough snow because it's not cold enough. You know, and they're having to like move the places of all these different sports because of this. So there's a lot of athletes who do winter sports who've started something called Protect Our Winters, just like winter sport athletes advocating for action on climate change. So whatever is like your thing or their thing, the person you're trying to talk to, for sure there's some sort of climate connection. Even if it's like, I really like chocolate and wine and coffee. It's like, well, those are 3 crops that are like very much at risk because of changing like weather and precipitation and heat. So
that'll get people to do something for sure.
You know, hops are getting harder to grow. So, you know, your artisanal beers are at risk because of climate change too. Like, if that's what it takes to get you on board, like, we can talk about that.
Hoda, you're on mute.
I'm watching the time, and I think we are, maybe we can take one more, if that's all right with you. I have a question here by Ania Railford. She says, I'm a Black female college studying to be a marine biologist. Talking about the many ways things have changed environmentally and finding ways to be helpful, what do you recommend as a way to continue to get ahead and seriously make a difference?
This is going to sound like a weird answer, but it's the answer that has worked for me, and that is trial and error. Like, we don't know exactly what's going to work with us as individuals professionally, and like, we have to just try something and then try the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and like be able to be nimble and iterate and move forward. I'm so excited you're going to be a marine biologist. We need you. There's so much work to be done. And, you know, the questions that people perhaps like you, and certainly I ask as a scientist, are different, right? Because I am the daughter of a Jamaican and was sort of like raised with an understanding of how magnificent those marine ecosystems used to be and how dependent on them people were. And like, who wants to live in the Caribbean if you can't have a fish fry because all the fish are gone, because the reefs are gone? Like, not me, right? So I think there's a lot that, you know, that people of color bring to science just in terms of the research questions we ask that are so different and complementary to the questions that and the research that other people are doing. So how to be most useful within that field, I would have to ask you like 20 questions before I could give a real answer. But I think a lot of it, like, trial and error is a totally legit way to go through the world, as long as you are learning from everything and like making the best decisions that you can. And I would just say that, like, you know, I don't recommend my personal career path because it's very hard to replicate, because it's like, you know, meet a billionaire who lets you run his nonprofit for a few years and then like meet important people in your field and then start your own consulting company and they'll hire you. Like, that is not a replicable model. And then start a think tank for coastal cities and write a book. Like, if you want to do those things, you should try. But like, I think my personal career path is not one that is like very easy to follow in terms of the steps, because it's been so like unusual, punctuated by these moments of opportunity that you can't like manufacture, but you can be prepared to take advantage of when they appear. But I'll just say, and I think this will apply more broadly, there's a lot of different ways to be involved, even as a marine biologist, right? You can do field research, you can do laboratory research, you can like be a researcher for the government government, for one of the federal agencies or a state agency. You can work on, like I did, I never wanted to do the research all the time. I wanted to use the science to inform policy. So I have, a scientist who does policy work. There's all the government positions, there's the academic positions, there's the nonprofit positions, there's positions like in philanthropy, deciding like who gets grants. There's just a lot of different ways to be a marine biologist and contribute. So I would encourage you to sort of explore as many of those as you can and see what what brings you the most joy and where you feel most useful, because that's what will keep you going, right? This work is hard. It's mostly thankless. There's no guarantee of success. So like finding colleagues that you love, you don't have to love them, but like colleagues that you have like a pleasant experience with, and you like want to keep going to work, like that's, I think, more important than specifically what you're doing, but that you're like able to find a context within which you can like bring your best contributions.
Dr. Johnson, I can't thank you enough for this wonderful, wonderful dynamic conversation. We have learned so much to reflect on, and you've given us some really good ideas about actions to take, things that we can consider as we move forward. So it's really been a pleasure to have you with us today. And I'm sure I thank you on behalf of everyone, Rashawn and myself, and of course the audience. I would like to just take a few minutes and announce our next scheduled event, which is for October 6th from 4 to 5:30 p.m. We are featuring Professor Jeffrey Herf. He's a distinguished university professor in the Department of History at the University of Maryland. His topic is continuity and change in anti-Semitic falsehoods from ancient times to the present. Again, this is another one of the prejudices that we have to deal with, and I really hope that you will consider joining us then. For all of our events, please go to our website, but also follow us on social media. And once again, I would really like to thank Dr. Johnson. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.